The Rundown with Carrie Saldo podcast is funded by Armbrook Village Senior Living in Westfield with support services designed to help seniors age in place, including a Compass Memory Support Neighborhood. More at armbrookvillage.com.
This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. I'm Carrie Saldo. Good morning. It's Friday, November 21st, 2025. Our Rundowners this week: Jane Kaufman, Community Voices editor of the Berkshire Eagle; Springfield Republican newspaper reporter Jim Kinney; and making his Rundown debut, Rich Parr, research director at the Mass Inc. polling group. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
If you at home have something to say, email the rundown at nepm.org. That's the rundown at nepm.org. Coming up later in the show, Springfield train ridership is down against a nationwide increase. How might that impact plans for East-West Rail? And with the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution ahead of us, we've been all hearing about the American Revolution series that's been on PBS this week with Ken Burns. We'll discuss a march through the 413 that helped to build this nation. But first, reporting by Commonwealth Beacon magazine, 11 campaigns for different ballot questions say that they've met requirements ahead of this week's deadline for the 2026 ballot. We're going to dig into some reporting about that. Chris Linsky from Commonwealth Beacon, quote, leaders of 11 different ballot question campaigns told Commonwealth Beacon they believe they've collected and filed enough signatures to keep their proposals in the mix, clearing the steepest hurdle en route to the 2026 election. He goes on to say that several steps will need to happen before any of those questions are a lock, but if organizers maintain their current course, voters will be empowered with a suite of monumental policy decisions about slashing the state's income tax rate by 1/5, mandating rent control statewide, which we'll talk about in a bit, and recriminalizing recreational marijuana and more. Thoughts? Jim Kinney, Rich Parr, Jane Kaufman on the overall number of questions that we are likely to see heading into the 2026 ballot.
It seems like an awful lot of work for voters to wade through this, and the kind of thing that I elected John Vilas to do.
And
right?
other state leaders. Right? Yeah. And then this is one of the criticisms or one of the reflections we heard from Secretary of State Bill Galvin this week, who said that he thinks that this is a reflection on the widespread discontent with the slow pace of lawmaking on Beacon Hill. And he said, quote, this represents a high tide of ballot questions, Rich Parr. What do you think?
Yeah, this would be an exceptional number of ballot questions compared to what we've typically gotten. And they've been on the rise over the past few cycles. You know, we've gone from like 2 or 3 to like 4 or 5, and now 11 would be a big jump up. We'll see how many of them actually come through. I think something that's happening regarding the legislature, sometimes people put ballot questions on as sort of as a bit of a tactic. It's a little bit of a game of chicken with the legislature, saying, well, if you guys don't deal with this issue, we're going to go to the voters, and then you'll have to deal with their decision on this, right? So sometimes ballot questions are used in that way, and then they end up not making it onto the ballot. But there's a whole host of issues that voters would have to decide here: taxes, rent control, as you mentioned, stuff having to do with elections and voting and registration. So, you know, it would be a lot for folks to study up on, and we don't have a culture of voters really having to do that much work when they get to their ballot in the fall.
We just got an email from someone saying, and I'm reading this in real time, rent control will only hurt the small investor and leave them no other option but to sell to big corporations. And they go on in a bit of detail. But we'll get into rent control in just a minute. One thing I'm thinking, though, about the overall number of ballot questions is whether we'll see more people get involved at the legislative level. To your point, Jim Kinney, saying, hey, look, I elected somebody to be doing this job. I'm not seeing a ton of action. Maybe I'll personally get involved. I also see the flip side of that being potential, saying like they're just going to wash their hands of it because they're frustrated with just an overall lack of inaction. So I think it'll be interesting to continue to watch as we get closer to deadlines. Jane Kaufman.
I just wanted to say that the idea of recriminalizing recreational use of marijuana is going to be really tricky with the place it plays in the economy of Massachusetts at this point. It's hard to imagine how to roll that back.
Yeah, put that genie back in the bottle. Agreed. It will be very interesting to watch that one. Okay, so we are going to dig into now rent control. There was a story in Commonwealth Beacon, Rich Parr, that you pointed out to me, and if this ballot question becomes a reality, it would be one of the most strict rent control policies in the country, the way it is currently written. It would apply to all of Massachusetts, not just cities and towns that have expressed an interest in the idea, which we've seen popping up now and again. But the legislature ultimately ends up defeating that. What stood out to you in this reporting by Jennifer Smith and Chris Linsky, who co-reported this for Commonwealth Beacon? Rich Parr.
I think the interesting thing about this is sort of the internal politics among people who actually want rent control but have a difference of opinion about how to advance it. So as you mentioned, this ballot question would be sort of the maximalist approach. It would say, we currently don't have rent control in Massachusetts because there was a ballot question that got rid of it a number of years ago.
30 or so, yeah.
Yeah, a long time ago.
Yep.
So now if a city and town wants it, they have to go to the legislature with a home rule petition in order to basically ask permission. So instead of just repealing that and saying, well, cities and towns can do whatever they want, this would actually prescribe exactly how the rent control would work in every city and town. And even some people who want rent control, including Boston Mayor Michelle Wu, are saying, well, this might not be the way to go here. We might need to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of what works for each different city and town. So it's just interesting to see kind of a rift between the advocates at this early stage. You know, the rule of thumb on ballot questions is that you want to start high and strong because over time the no campaign is going to come in and kind of chip away at your support. So it's not getting off to the best of starts, I would say, if you're a person who wants
polling on this?
So the polling on rent control kind of varies depending on how you ask the question. I've seen majority support for the concept of rent control, and I think the term rent control does very well. But if you frame it as the government stopping, private landlords from charging the rents they want to, that's a little bit less popular, right? So it really does depend on how you frame it. And I think what you're going to see going forward this campaign is the yes campaign will have their message. The no campaign will focus more on those small landlords who might, potentially be put in a tough spot if they're not able to raise rents to keep up with what they need to. And also the question of, will this impinge our ability to create more housing on the supply side? So I think it really depends on how you ask the question.
Jane Kaufman.
I was really struck by this quote in the story from Dan Cohen, a veteran Democratic strategist. I think it's worth noting that he's a Democratic strategist. Quote, they're putting forward an instrument that is so blunt that suddenly the real estate industry arguments are not going to be entirely wrong. So I just thought that was a very interesting perspective on this.
Yeah. And I think, the people who are supporting this have said that they're frustrated that the legislature, in part, hasn't made moves on this. And so they're stepping forward with a proposal that they think is even-handed. I have a quote in my notes, which I can't find at the tip of my fingers right now, but they're saying that this would be, a 5% allowable increase or tied to the consumer price index, sort of whichever is less. I think it'll be interesting to watch here in Western Massachusetts because there is an exemption in the way that this is currently written for dwelling units for which the first residential certificate of occupancy is less than 10 years old. So new buildings, right? In Western Massachusetts, what do we have a plethora of? Old buildings, old empty mill buildings, which maybe would fall under this new CO if you renovated those. But for small business owners like myself and my husband, we own some rental properties in this region. And what happens if we do a full interior renovation of that space? Does then that qualify as new? I think those are the details that people like myself are going to be watching really, really closely. I also think that this is a really robust issue that we'll continue to have tons of questions about. Jim Kinney, you are also doing some reporting this week. The housing secretary at Augustus was in the 413. You met up with him in and around Springfield. What stood out to you of what you heard at that particular conference?
They were talking about fair housing, which is enforcing all the sorts of rules about access for minorities and especially families with children, young children, to the housing market. One of the things that stood out is just how tight the market is. And they're talking about rents in Springfield, maybe $1,800 a month for an okay place. So that in such a tight market, that means that a tenant is very reluctant to start to complain, even when there are legitimate complaints: no heat, no hot water. One of the attorneys working on these cases talked about a typical situation where a woman would be maybe sexually harassed or propositioned as part of a landlord-tenant dispute. And it's all happening against the backdrop of the federal government not being aggressive enforcing these things anymore, and the state not having that partner.
And I saw in your reporting that there is some state movement to try and get at this. There's going to be some type of a grant supporting issues around this.
There was some money in the supplemental budget to fund agencies to work with tenants. And they're putting out an RFP. And, of course, I'm in a room full of advocates. And once they said an RFP, everybody's ears went up.
Exciting at the prospect of potentially getting some dollars to support what is a very serious issue. Because one of the things you mentioned, we've seen here in Springfield as highly problematic, people who were reluctant to come forward, or in the case of Springfield Gardens, which also was in the news this week because the Attorney General was in town discussing the fact that there had been a settlement. Springfield Gardens is a very large housing complex, and the owners are no longer, they have since sold the property, and they are no longer allowed to own property in the state of Massachusetts after the Attorney General settled with them 26,000 plus reports of housing issues within those units that went either unaddressed or underaddressed according to the AG's findings. And it prompted the Attorney General's office to release this week an updated guide for both landlords and tenants to know their rights. What do you make of the fact that something that happened in Springfield is impacting statewide policy in such a way?
The Springfield Gardens thing never should have gotten as big or as bad as it got.
I mean, Springfield Republican reporting on this goes back years. I was looking at the archives.
Yeah, well, we started getting phone calls, and some of the stories in these buildings were horrible. One of the major issues was that the buildings themselves weren't secured, so anybody could walk in, and there were vacant apartments that were just sort of abandoned, and drug dealers would set up in there, or rival drug dealers would set up in the same building. You had running gun battles. It never should have gotten as bad as it did, and the tenants are poor, sometimes not educated, reluctant to go to City Hall, reluctant to make a lot of noise about this because they feared being out on the street or they feared some other kind of repercussion.
So, Rich Parr, what do you make of the fact that the Attorney General has now said, look, here are your rights, know them and use them?
Yeah, I think it's really important because, we did a survey earlier this year of tenants and landlords in the state's rental voucher program. So this is people who are getting state assistance or in some cases federal assistance through the state to help pay for their rent. And it's a great program. What we found was that the tenants were extremely grateful and satisfied for it because many of them were coming, this voucher was the difference between them being in a really bad housing situation or no housing situation at all. So this is an extremely vulnerable population, right? And the landlords were also pretty happy with the program in terms of it helping them to, be able to offer somebody an apartment that they might not have been able to offer to because because they wouldn't be able to make that rent. But I was just really struck by reading, the responses in that survey of just how vulnerable this population is. So getting this information out to people, making them understand what their rights are and how it could help them is I think even more important because as Jim was saying, there's a lot of people who don't feel like they can speak up because they're afraid they're going to lose that housing, they're going to lose that voucher. They don't know their own rights necessarily because they may not be as experienced with the system.
Absolutely. Well, know your rights and speak up about them. All right. When we return, the panel's thoughts on the latest Amtrak train ridership numbers and why and how they might impact Western Mass, and why historians are still debating Henry Knox March through the Berkshires. Plus, scoops, praise, and predictions right after this. If you have thoughts, email the rundown at nepm.org. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. I'm Carrie Saldo, joined by journalist Jane Kaufman and Jim Kinney and polling guru Rich Parr. Let's get back into it. If you have thoughts, email the rundown at nepm.org. Jim Kinney, a headline in the Springfield Republican this week: Amtrak. Passenger traffic up nationwide, but some Springfield trains down 17% in ridership. And Springfield train ridership is down against that nationwide increase. Tell us a bit more about what you learned, Jim.
A lot of it has to do with scheduling. There's a lot of different factors. Sometimes scheduling, sometimes availability. Also, the north-south route through Springfield is also served by CT Rail, which is a Connecticut state-run service, and they're up. They do less of a good job of sort of breaking down where on the route people are getting on and off. It's very much tied to the economy. In Connecticut, on the CT Rail side, it's also very much tied to whatever is happening at Yale, because it's such a big employer on the New Haven side. Meanwhile, the state's working for increased east-west rail, increased passenger service Pittsfield, Springfield, Worcester, Boston. That process is ongoing, but very slowly ongoing. Also done against the backdrop of a federal government that's less interested in mass transportation.
Rich Parr, transportation is among the issues that you watch there at the polling group. What do you make of this information?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. Well, first off, just as a resident, I've taken that Valley Flyer train down from Northampton to New Haven. Monty, back when he was at the old radio station in Northampton, organized a little trip for it, kind of as a kickoff, like an inaugural run.
Monty Belmonte, co-host of
Monty
the fabulous
Belmonte,
413 here on NPM. Shameless plug.
But I was looking at the schedule for it today, and it's like it would take a long time for you to get from Northampton to New Haven if you wanted to on the train. So I can understand why maybe that use case for the train is maybe not is having a little bit more trouble than some of the other use cases for Amtrak, where we're seeing big problems in the airline industry, and maybe people are thinking about, well, I'll take a train from Boston to New York instead of flying, or Boston to DC instead of flying, something like that. We do have a little bit of polling. We did ask low-income residents in Hampden and Hampshire County some questions for Mass DOT last year, and one of them was about East-West Rail. If it were to happen, would you be likely to ride it? And we did get majorities of people saying that they'd be at least somewhat interested in riding this service if it came along. But in the focus groups that we did along with that polling, we also heard a lot of skepticism. Some people were like, well, is it ever going to happen? I've been hearing about this for years. Other people were like, it's all going to depend on how much it costs. If it's priced like an Amtrak ride, I'm probably not going to pay that. But if it's priced more like the commuter rail is in Boston, where it's a little bit more reasonable, that would be something I would consider. So there's a lot of factors, I think, that are going to go into whether people ultimately ride this when it happens or not.
As with many issues that are complex, it's all in the granular and in those details. I was interested to read, Jim, that you reported that Amtrak said ridership decreased 3.9% on the Lakeshore Limited, which is the only east-west rail right now through Springfield, and the Lakeshore has daily service between Boston South Station, Albany, New York, and then Framingham, Worcester, Springfield, Pittsfield. So we have some stops. Do you think that decrease is sort of a one-time blip, given that weird sinkhole that happened? Or is this something bigger to consider in the face of East-West Rail?
The Lakeshore is a long-distance train. They're going to Chicago. And that makes it complicated. It's not really scheduled, like as you were saying, Rich, to take into Boston and go to the museums for the day and then come out. This kind of trips that people would use for a commuter rail. Take the train into Boston for a day of meetings and then come home at 5:30 or 6 and work on the train on the way home. That's really what the vision is for East-West Rail. Someone to be able to maybe not do a daily commute, but if you have to be in Boston 1 or 2 days a week, it makes some sense. They want to make that make sense.
It doesn't make sense if you're actually going west. I just looked at the schedule today. It's a 19-hour and 28-minute trip to Cleveland. Now, I know not many people are traveling to Cleveland, but I have. It leaves at 7:25 a.m. and arrives at 2:53 a.m. the next day. You can drive to Cleveland in about 9 hours from here. So,
unless you have a ton of reading or work that you want to do, that we don't have autonomous cars yet, so that you want to do, that maybe that train is not the wisest option there, as Jane points out, or the most efficient in terms of how you might want to use your time. As somebody who used to live outside of New York City, and used the subway a ton, I loved that time on a commuter train to do work. I mean, this is before the days of like cell phones being everywhere. There were some cell phone use, so now there's more distraction, I think, than perhaps there used to be. But I personally am looking forward to, if we have that east-west rail, if it actually moves through. All right, Jane, let's move on to a story by you this week. Why are historians still debating Henry Knox marched through the Berkshires, was what the headline said. A march that helped build this nation. I want to quote a little bit about what you wrote. 250 years after 25-year-old Boston bookseller named Henry Knox dragged 59 cannons up and over the Berkshire Hills in the dead of winter, one question still intrigues historian. Exactly which way did he go? Jane Kaufman, what got you thinking about this?
I went to it was a supposedly like just an easy weekend assignment at the Arrowhead, Herman Melville's Arrowhead in Pittsfield, which is where he lived, which was kind of a reenactment by someone from Fort Ticonderoga. And I got back and my editor had written a note, the weekend editor, Mitchell Chapman, had written a note saying, this deserves much bigger coverage. That's how it started.
Which is the cue for start digging, reporter.
Yeah, and
digging.
so thankfully, shortly thereafter, I learned that the route was still being debated, and I got a chance to talk with people who have been literally on the ground tracing Henry Knox's footsteps, trying to map out and survey the actual route, which is pretty interesting. And there are, in certain areas, there are as many as 6 potential, even 7 potential routes. In some areas it was fewer, but it was very interesting. And for example, apparently the Monterey marker on Route 23 is thought not to be anywhere near where Henry Knox or his teamsters went.
So it's really this very careful, these people who have this very keen interest in the sort of careful excavation of the actual history of what happened. But it was really remarkable to look at the detail in your story. The largest cannons measured 11 feet long and weighed 5,000 pounds apiece. And they were doing this under not easy conditions, right?
Yeah, well, the whole point was to be able to get these sleds, think pallets, essentially, like great big pallets like you'd see in a truck pull, being pulled either by horses or oxen. Both did the job, across lakes, across rivers, frozen. In fact, apparently at one point, Henry Knox had people drill holes in the ice of what bodies of water in order to get better ice, so they could refreeze, and it would be easier for them to go over. They did lose one cannon in the Mohawk River, but they were able to retrieve it later, amazingly.
Wow.
So,
and
yeah.
also, we're not talking about paved paths.
Right.
They were bushwhacking through they were going through the woods.
Yeah, they were not bushwhacking, but they couldn't bushwhack. You couldn't bushwhack with this kind of, but they were using essentially trails, or what we would think of as woods roads. Yeah.
And in terms of what we know about the route that he took, these folks got interested in testing whether or not that was correct. But exactly which way did he go through the Berkshires? Why is this particular piece of interest to these folks?
I think because some of them live there, they all live there, and they kind of want to know, like, where was this sort of particular ground? Which way did he go? Which way did his teamsters go? He may not have actually taken the same route as his teamsters. He actually, at one point, talks about catching up to the 1st Division. So he stayed behind in Albany at one point to do, I don't even know what, I forget, but anyway.
And in particularly, great time to be looking at this because we have the 250th anniversary of the Revolution coming
Yes,
up.
in fact, this didn't make it into my article, but George Washington's order to Henry Knox was actually penned on November 16th, 1775. So
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Fascinating to look at this. And also I was thinking about how something like this would never happen today, because part of what Knox and his crew were doing, right, this was secret because they were going to surprise, hopefully, the British on their way in Boston. So I just imagine people like taking selfies along the way as they're going, or folks they may have encountered. How just that this is one of the things like sort of gets lost to history, the way we live our lives today. Jim, Rich, anything that stood out to you in the reporting?
It was fascinating, especially because I live in Westfield, not far away from one of those Knox markers on Main Street, Route 20. And I guess people just sort of always assumed that Route 20 was always Route 20, or 23 or 17 was always the main route. One of the other interesting things in the record is they talk about when they get to Westfield, apparently they were fed, and they talk about the quality of the food and the cider. So not a lot of operational security there, maybe. I don't know.
Rich Parr, anything for you that stood out?
Well, I think it's just fascinating to think about how this part of the country played a role in the revolution, with the Ken Burns documentary happening now, and that you can go out and actually find markers of this history, not far from where we all live. So great job reporting all this. This is really fascinating.
History all around us. Thanks for a window into that this week, Jane, or recently. And you can check out the story in the Berkshire Eagle. All right, I'm going to move us on to our scoop, praise, and prediction, where we make a prediction about the news, maybe dish on a story that you're working on, or heap some praise on a newsworthy nugget. Jim Kinney, let me start with you this morning. Scoop, praise, prediction, what's on your mind?
This is a prediction. A week or so ago, I covered a meeting of the State Gaming Commission where Springfield Mayor Dom Sarno complained rather forcefully to MGM and to the commission that nothing has happened with MGM's building at the corner of State and Main, a few blocks from here.
Get that scaffolding down, I think was the quote, or close to it.
Yeah, and the Jersey barriers. My prediction, given the cool reception from MGM and what we know about the business that has been attracted there, the Jersey barriers and the scaffolding is going to be there for a long time.
Well, we'll keep tracking that here on the Rundown. Rich Parr, how about for you? Scoop, praise, prediction?
Praise or congratulations, I guess, to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary based here in Springfield on the publication of a new edition of their collegiate dictionary. But more importantly, they had an epic cake to celebrate this, and you can go find the pictures on social media. I think Peter Sokolowski, who does Jazz Alamode a couple nights a week here, posted pictures. It's this massive cake that actually looks like the dictionary. It's got the red cover. It's got all of the script on the top. It's got actually the little page tabs for separating the different letters.
I
on the
zoomed
side.
in on those page tabs. I think that they're little chocolates that are sort of very precisely cut in half. The level of detail on this cake is amazing.
Yeah, it's really
Peter
amazing.
Sokolowski, while he does jazz here, also the editor-at-large of Merriam-Webster Dictionary there in Springfield.
Yes, so good job on the cake, guys.
It looks delicious. Jane Kaufman, how about for you?
Dylan Thompson's coverage of a Dalton hearing that went nowhere on a plan to expand Berkshire Concrete's sand pit is unbelievably riveting.
Right.
I recommend it. That's in the Berkshire Eagle.
Check that out in the Berkshire Eagle. I have praise this week. I read in the Springfield Republican, and NEPM's Joe Kaufman had coverage of it too. This idea of a gleaner. These folks who volunteer to go out to farmlands and harvest what's left of the crop that would sit there otherwise unharvested, and also the farmers who are allowing folks to go and pick this food so that it gets used by folks who need it. We've heard a lot in the recent weeks about the hunger issues because of the relationship that the SNAP benefits have not been rolled out, and so praise for gleaners this week. All right, I want to thank our Rundown panel here this morning. Jane Kaufman, Community Voices Editor at the Berkshire Eagle, Jim Kinney, a reporter at the Springfield Republican, and Rich Parr of the Mass Inc. Polling Group, the research director there. My thanks to all of you this morning. The Rundown anthem is by the Love Crumbs. Our director is Tony Dunn. Our board op is Bart Rankin. Our engineers are Phil Bishop, Kara Foster, Dave Sears, and Chuck Dubé. Production support is by Ayu Suryawan. Thanks for joining us this week on The Rundown. I'm Carrie Saldo. Catch us here every Friday at 9 on 88.5 NEPM.